We're ready to begin. Let me welcome you to St. James Chapel for the first of our 2014 Fireside Chats. You might be interested to know that these chats began in 2011 as part of our bicentennial celebration. It was an effort to inform not only our parishioners, but also the community about the history of St. James Church. We call them Fireside Chats because we plan to have them in the reading room in front of the fireplace. Also, President Franklin Roosevelt coined the term Fireside Chats, so we thought it was appropriate to use that term since he was a member of St. James and was actually baptized here in the chapel. We had no idea how many people to expect, but as folks began to pour into the reading room, it was obvious that it wouldn't handle everybody, and so we had to move into the chapel where we are tonight. So based on the success of the early chats, we've continued with this series each year. And now we just plan on taking up both the chapel and the reading room. So I guess that's a good thing. It looks like tonight's topic is one of great interest and one that has long been overlooked. The very year that the Dutch bought Manhattan from the Native Americans in 1626, they brought over the first 11 slaves to New Amsterdam. Slavery continued and expanded under the English, and by 1703, nearly 43% of the households of New York State had slaves. We are pleased to have with us tonight Lorraine Roberts to tell us a little bit more about the impact of those slaves in the early development of New York State. Lorraine is a member of the Black History Project Committee of the Dutchess County Historical Society and the Mid-Hudson Anti-Slavery Project Committee. Lorraine retired from the Poughkeepsie City School District in 1996 after serving 30 years as a business education teacher and chair of the Occupational Education Department. She continued to be involved in her professional organizations, serving as president and treasurer on the local and state level. She's been actively volunteering and served in leadership roles in various community organizations, including the Dutchess County United Way, Dutchess County Girl Scout Council, Dutchess County Historical Society, and Eleanor Roosevelt Center at Valkill, among others. She also served in a leadership capacity for the Community Foundation of Mid-Hudson Valley, the Interfaith Council of Dutchess County, and the New Day Repertory Theater. Lorraine has been recognized over the years for her outstanding dedication and contributions to the community. And in 2010, she received the United Way Award for Service. She's a very busy lady, as you can see, and we're very fortunate to have her with us this evening. So please help me welcome Lorraine Roberts.
When Gloria first asked me about coming to speak about slavery, I thought I knew something about it. But as I researched, I found I knew very little. And that this topic is such a hot topic that I really needed to do a lot of research. I thought I knew slavery. Slavery is an ancient history. I knew that the Egyptians had slaves, they built pyramids. I knew all of this. But almost 80 years ago, Eleanor Roosevelt, under her leadership, wrote the Declaration of Human Rights. It was adopted by the United Nations in 1944. It serves as a basis for many treaties and the expectations of nations to adopt some of its precepts in their particular documents. Today, however, in some modern countries of Africa, Asia, and the Americas, there is still some form of human bondage. In our own country, we have evidence of illegal immigrants that sell their labor for food and shelter, working long hours and under terrible conditions in some cases, not saying a word for fear of deportation. We even have private companies running some of our penal institutions where men and women who are imprisoned. I was wondering what was going on, and I said, In our country, we even have evidence of illegal immigrants that sell their labor for food and shelter, not saying a word because they have fear of deportation. We have private companies running some of our penal institutions where men and women are in prison working for a few cents, and this directly benefits large business. No matter what it is called, these illustrations are the need for labor to satisfy personal wealth and greed. Today, there are a different form of slavery, but whatever it is slavery by another name. Tonight, I in part am going to talk about chattel slavery, the type of slavery which dehumanized the African slave. It is an institution form which is indeed different from an indentured servant or serfdom. Serfdom is generally connected to land. Servitude is directly connected to time. A chattel slave was thought to be property, not human. When the first Africans stepped foot in Jamestown in 1619, there was an uncertain legal status he had, but they were considered humans. They were given the status of indentured servant, which meant they were free after a period of time. Thus, their offsprings were free. As the British took over from the Dutch, and they became the prominent players in the African slave trade, the need for more labor was crucial, and the desire for more and more wealth dictated this need. The most hideous and misconstrued racial bigotry over time was orchestrated against the African slave. They looked different. Their color was different. Furthermore, in the distorted minds of some whites, the black man was not a man at all. He was not human. He was chattel property. In the Americas, and I have up on the screen a man begging that, am I not a man? In the Americas, the Barbados Slave Code of 1661 was among the first to legally codify the African as chattel. Gradually, the colonies of Virginia began to enact laws restricting the rights of the African slave as early as 1636. In 1696, South Carolina adopted similar guidelines, establishing for the colonies of slavery in British North America the mandate giving the enslaver absolute control and ownership of the Africans, Native Americans, and mulattoes. This law extended to their offsprings, even if one parent was white. This meant that the offspring was considered to be a chattel slave. These were property laws, and thus the African slave by law and by white mindset was property. Property of another person to be held, used, or abused by the owner. By the mid-18th century, there were many laws enacted in all the colonies, which further restricted what was to be done with the chattel slave. These laws regulated dress, assembly, restrained teaching of any kind, restrained punishment, restrained having firearms, and it goes on. There was no protection under the law, no protection for a thing. It is estimated that between 400,000 Africans were brought to this colony between 1600 and 1800. The Founding Fathers wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. George Washington, our first president, led the Continental Army during the American Revolution and fought for this principle. However, when it came to his chattel slaves, this was entirely a different matter. The African slave and any who had African blood were legally dehumanized. I think some of you may have heard the story about Philadelphia digging for their Liberty Center. When they dug, they found that under that site was the first president's house, 520 Market Street. Washington brought 9 slaves with him to Philadelphia. Pennsylvania had begun the abolition of slavery in 1780. However, it permitted slaveholders from other states to come into Pennsylvania to hold their slaves for up to 6 months, and then they would let them go free. But Washington circumvented this law. He rotated his slaves between Mount Vernon and Pennsylvania. Among his slaves were 2, Annie James and Hercules. Annie James had friends in Philadelphia that were free, and they helped her escape. She planned her escape very carefully, and she went to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Now, I'm not going to tell you the trials and tribulations Washington had in trying to get her back. That's a long story. But I am going to tell you about the slave Hercules. And I have his picture up on the screen. This picture was painted by Gilbert Stewart. Since my trip to Philadelphia, I have learned that it has been documented that Hercules was sent back to Mount Vernon, and he was assigned duties other than cooking. He was really a very noted chef. He escaped Mount Vernon on February 1797 and returned to Philadelphia. Later, he went to New York, and the information is lost about him. But it's interesting to note that in 1801, when Washington died, his will freed all of his slaves, except Annie Judge Staines. Her name was not among the names that Washington freed. I'd like to contrast Southern slavery with Northern slavery. The need for slave labor in the South, and I'm referring to the area of Old South, that would be Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Alabama, and Georgia. That's the Old South. I'd like to contrast that with the labor needs in the North, and generally we are talking about Pennsylvania, New York, and New Hampshire, New England states. The slavery was different. It is explained that the South had large cotton plantations, so they needed a large number of slaves. The North, on the other hand, had more of an industrial society. This is somewhat true, but it doesn't reflect the entire story. The large cotton plantations of the South were relatively few in number and were owned by the wealthy. On the other hand, there were numerous small farms which needed fewer laborers. There was a need for free labor to work the fields, planting and harvesting the crops of tobacco, rice, indigo, and of course the great cotton crop. However, the large plantations as the major slave labor force is a fallacy. There were many more African slaves working as free labor on the smaller farms than those who worked the fields of the large plantations. Yes, the South was an agrarian society. However, it's a myth to think of it as being made up of large plantations only. The entire Old South had a total need for free labor because it was basically agricultural. Most of that free labor was concentrated on small farms. In the North, however, there were those slaves who worked in the mills, industrial sites, and in the shipping industry, as well as in small farms. The North's economy dictated the need for a more semi-skilled and a skilled laborer. And of course, the labor of slaves was free. As the practice of slavery became less popular in the North, the society tended to gradually use other forms of labor rather than slave labor, like indentured help from Europe. Because of this shift in the use of labor, free labor, it is my belief that many Northerners are of the opinion that chattel slavery did not exist in the North. Nothing is further from the truth. At the height of chattel slavery and free labor in that vein, New York State had more slaves than the state of Maryland. Slavery in New York State. Slavery began in New York State in 1626 with the Dutch West India Company bringing 11 African slaves to New Amsterdam. For 20 years, the company had imported African slaves in the Caribbean countries, which had Dutch colonies as well as in New Amsterdam. However, the African slaves in New Netherlands, part of New Amsterdam, were described by the Dutch to be proud and treacherous. The company began shipments from the Caribbean of Africans, since these slaves appeared to be more docile and easier to handle. I have a picture up on the screen of the first auction of a slave in New Netherlands. It's 1643. Now, this picture was painted in 1917, so I think that the author of the picture probably thought that this is what it must have looked like. But that is a picture of it in 1643. These chattel slaves were the backbone of building the city of New York, as shown in the wonderful exhibition of the New York Historical Society in 2007. That exhibition was Slavery in New York, and it was a great exhibition because it pointed out to those in New York that the shipping industry was dependent on transporting the cotton and other products to Europe and other markets. That's why they wanted the free labor. The male slave worked in the docks. The female slave primarily worked around the house, of their enslavers. The African Burial Ground, a national monument down in Lower New York, is a testimony that between 15,000 and 20,000 people of African or African descent, their remains were found between 1991 and 2003. The recognition of those who had an integral part in building the city of New York is remembered at the African Burial Grounds. It's a testimony to that kind of labor force. This burial ground was dedicated in 2007. Now, traveling up the Hudson, a river that was explored by Henry Hudson in 1609, we come to the area today known as Dutchess County. Dutchess County was formed in 1683, honoring King James II's wife, Maria Beatrice Este. Land patents were large tracts of land, and Dutchess County, or the area, had about 650 acres of land. This land was purchased from the Indians by the throne of England. There are accounts of treaties which resulted in highway robbery of Indian lands. In the end, the land finally was the king's, and it was divided up by his governors. And I think I'll show you the 9 partners, the Schuyler, and the Roundabout Pact. Let's see if I can get this down here at the bottom. This area was the Roundabout Pact. It was the first patent, and it was given to Francis Roundabout and Gillian Verplanck. They had 85,000 acres of land, quite a sizable piece of land. The next patent was up here. Uh-oh. See, that's technology. It was up here at the Schuyler patent. And this was 1686 given to Robert Livingston. But the real big patent was down here. The 9 partners. Look at all this land. It's over 150,000 acres of land. A lot of land to be given. And then the rest of the county was broken up into other patents at other times. Land patents were given to encourage clearing and the settlement of the land. That's the primary purpose of their giving them. Some people bought, some people were given, some people just came by it. It is interesting to note that at first the lands were thought to be ideal for fur trading and lumbering. However, the early settlers found that the land was also great for farming. Population data shows that in 1703, there were 1,480 whites to 145 slaves. The slave population was 10% of the white settlement. When Jacobus Stoutenberg came to the area as its first settler about 1740, there was no town called Hyde Park. What is now Hyde Park was a part of the town of Clinton. The town of Hyde Park was established in 1821. So we say that Jacobus Tobias Stoutenberg was Hyde Park's first settler. Okay. Over time, he built 3 houses. In fact, one of his stone houses exists today. It's that Japanese restaurant that used to be on Route 9. That is, I think, the second or third house that he built. When Jacobus Stattenberg died in 1772, his will freed all of his slaves. And I think you'll get a kick out of seeing a picture of, can you see that good? That's a wood cutting, but that's somewhat what he looked like. Some of the early settlers of Dutchess County brought their slaves with them. By the mid-1700s, there were 9,265 whites to 465 slaves. Fishkill, Poughkeepsie, and Rhinebeck had developed into dual economic communities. It was in these 3 communities that most of the slaves in Dutchess County lived and worked. These communities were known for their shipping industry, as well as mills, their stores, their small shops, offering a variety of services, as well as farming. Slaves were used to supply the cheap labor. Slaves worked as artisans. Slaves did the back-breaking work on the docks. Slaves then became cobblers, masons, and sawyers. Slaves also worked in agriculture for the rich landlords along the river. The Livingstons owned slaves, the Bards, Beekmans, and other river families. Inland principally, Dutchess County was agriculture, and slaves worked in the fields or in and around the house. There was still much land to be cleared in the inland settlements. These inland communities had fewer slaves. There is a story that I'd like to tell you, and I think I'm going to just tell it anyway. It's about Eppie Stoughton. Eppie was a slave woman, and she lived in what is called Stormville. If you take the Taconic south to Beekman Road, you make that sharp left, go through the light, the first right is Phillips Road. About 1 mile down the road, you will see a large white farmhouse. This farmhouse in the 1700s was Garrett Starm. We're actually in Starmville, named after Garrett's family. About the time of the American Revolution, there was much tension in this area. Oh, my mic. I'm getting dressed. Can it just hang? Oh, not really, he says. Okay. About the time of the American Revolution, there was much tension in the area. Garrett Starm was an outspoken Whig. Now, the Whigs favored the Americans, and they wanted independence from England. The Tories, on the other hand, were Americans who wanted to keep the tradition and the power of the British Crown. Garrett owned black slaves who worked in his house and in his field. He owned a young slave woman named Eppie Stoughton. I'm going to take privilege and license to tell the story of the way Eppie might have told it. One day I was in the kitchen working. I heard a knock on the door, and I went to the front door, and 3 men brushed by me, went into the living room, grabbed Master Garrett Storm. Oh my goodness, he suffered, his face was beet red, and they dragged him up the stairs. Well, I knew they weren't of the persuasion of Master Garrett. So I quickly and very silently crept up the steps, and I hid behind the eaves, waiting to see what they would do. When I peeped, I couldn't believe my eyes. They had hung Master Garrett by his feet. And then they went down the stairs, saying bad things about Master. Well, when they got outside the house, I crept out from behind the eaves. I cut Master Garrett down. He was red and he was bulging. He was about 54 years old, and he couldn't fight in the militia. But he was a mighty grateful man because I saved his life. A few years later, 20 to be exact, he wrote in his diary that I was to be taken care of the rest of my days on the farm. Effie lived on the farm for the rest of her days. And when she died, they buried her in the slave cemetery across the road. That's called the slave cemetery of the Storm family. We would not have known anything about her unless Garrett had not written this account in his will. Early slavery movement in New York State. One cannot underestimate the importance of the anti-slavery movement in many households. In many households, slaves breathed the air of their masters. They lived in the households, in the cellar. They ate in the household of the master. Questions began to develop. Is it true that this is a chattel slave? And slowly, people began to change their opinions. We have the case of the Oblong Meeting House of Quakers. And this section of Quakers had more people than in Philadelphia. It was the largest Quaker settlement, the Oblong Meeting House of Quakers outside of Philadelphia. In 1741, there was discussions regarding Quakers and their moral concern about slavery. By 1767, the first direct action against slavery won out. Although the anti-slavery movement among the Quakers was not unanimous. Some members had slaves until 1779. That's 10 years after they voted that slavery for them would be a moral issue that they could not abide. In 1780, the Nine Partners Meeting House was established, and it became the site for supporting fugitive slaves. The 1796, the Quakers opened the Nine Partners Schoolhouse, and Deborah and Jacob Willits headed a curriculum that taught the evils of slavery. Lucretia Goffin Mott was one of the famous students fighting for women's rights later, and she was a noted abolitionist. The effects of the American Revolution on slavery. In Dutchess County, some slaves escaped through runaway methods. Some fought for the American Revolution. Some fought for the British. Some fought for the Americans. It was free labor in any case. They were the soldiers in the field. In 1781, New York State enacted a law which gave freedom to all slaves in the state's armed militia, those who had fought. The war years were a time of separation of family and a time of uncertainty for the slave population. The slave was property, and he was an investment, even though the sentiments against slavery was long evident. Graveyards are a wonderful place to discover the not so obvious. In 2009, Brian McAdoo, and he was a professor at Vassar College, ran a course in which he wanted to explore, at the insistence of the Historical Society, Section E of the Rhinebeck Association Cemetery. Now that section is called Potter's Field, or the Colored Burial Grounds. Dr. McAdoo interested another professor, Dr. Quincy Mills, to join with his class and do the historical research. On a knoll facing Section E are about 18 headstones, and they belong to a family of Fraser. I was curious about the Fraser plot, so I asked them to investigate these graves too, as well as Section E. I don't think this is a very good picture, but you can see Andrew Fraser on that tombstone. Can you see that? Yeah. The oldest stone is that of Andrew Fraser. It reads, "In the Revolutionary War of 1776, in memory of Andrew Fraser, who died June 2nd, 1846, aged 102 years, 11 months, and 18 days. He's an old man. These were the headstones of the Fraser family. There was somebody named Robert, somebody named Susan, and other Frasers. Who were they? Why were they buried here and not in Section E? During the summer of 2009, the students really did their research. It was found that Andrew Fraser was a colored man having a Scotch father and a black mother. He did serve the Americans in the Revolutionary War, but the dates are unknown. It was surmised that from his pension he bought a farm in Milan, where he raised a family. He and his wife had 11 children. Robert was one of those children, so that took care of that. Through documentation, we have proof of a black man who was freed, who fought in the American Revolutionary War. We don't know when. He purchased land in the town of Milan. Remember, Andrew died in 1846, just short of his 103rd birthday. He must have been in his 30s when he fought. It is surmised that he purchased the land by the time he was 40 from his pension. He was a free man by the graces of war. According to the 1790 population data on Dutchess County, there were 440 free Negroes, 1,856 slaves, and about 43,000 whites, just 440 free. Gradual manumission was given by the law in the state of New York to children born after July 4th, 1799, provided that they worked, the males, until age 28, and the females until age 25. Others were slave for life, so you had this mixed kind of action going on. This was further modified by the law of 1817, and this is the important law, that read that every Negro and mulatto within the state born before the 4th of July, 1799, shall, and after the 4th day of July, 1827, so it's 10 years from this time, they will be free. Between 1799 and 1827, there was much tension concerning slavery. Many slaves were generally in the state of dishevel. After 1827, unrest continued. However, slavery in New York State was all over. Over time, the chattel slave had gradually been replaced in the minds of people. Although slavery retained its original definition as property, in the minds of some, the slaves had been elevated over time to be human. Hyde Park and the Guinea community. As I said, Hyde Park was a part of the town of Clinton when Jacobus Stoutenberg first came. Peter Falcone also had been a great patent buyer. He bought some of the land of the 9 partners. This was an excess piece of land. He sold his interest to his daughter, who sold her interest to her son-in-law, Dr. John Bard. In 1772, when Dr. John Bard moved to the area, he bought 47 slaves with him, and he named his land Hyde Park. By 1790, Dr. John Bard had become financially distressed and had sold some of his land. The rest he left to his son, Dr. Samuel Bard. Dr. Samuel Bard donated the land for the building of St. James Church. It is recorded to the rector, church wardens, and vestry of St. James Church at Hyde Park by deed dated May 15, 1812, 2 acres of land for the building of a church. The Dutchess County Historical Society was extremely fortunate to have Dr. Christopher and Susan Lidner, and they are of the Hinkle and Lidner Archaeology and Education firm, with the permission of the town of Hyde Park, to begin the dig of the Guinea site in 2009, and in the year 2000. Susan Hinkle documented work showing that the site of Guinea was called Short Mountain. In the 1939 Dutchess County Historical Society's yearbook, and that was written by Henry Hackett, there is a map showing the lots that were sold. Interesting that blacks own these lots as well as whites. And you can see the lots. Now, let's see if I can. Up here is Market Street. You follow Market Street across now what is called the Guinea Bridge, and you come down, and up on a knoll above Market Street is where the Guinea site is located. That is Henry Hackett's property. And then Market Street goes on around and finally out to Route 90, and you come to Mill Road. He sold the property to both white and black owners. Lot number 6. Yeah, let's see. Hmm. Well, anyway, lot number 6 on that belonged to Primus Martin. And what I wanted to show you was the 1790 census records, which show Primus Martin as a free man, and that was 1790. I'm not sure of the definition of when he became free. There were 3 field schools in which Bard students and other students worked. We do know that there is the Bramer Journals, and they're located at FDR Library. Edward Bramen wrote an oral history of people here in Hyde Park between 1875 and 1899. His notebooks are invaluable because they describe many of the lives of some of the slaves here in Hyde Park who were emancipated in 1827. He says that Primus Martin was a Bard Negro. This suggests that he was once owned by the Bards. The road to Dalmatier Mills ran through the southeast portion of Faulkner's patent. It is rough land, and the Bards sold off some small lots to Negroes and also some to whites. On this road, Primus, or Prime as he usually was called, owned quite a farm. He and his wife, Betty Prime, were industrious and were well respected. There are the evidence of what was done by the Bard students showed that they collected a lot of artifacts, hundreds of items. Some of these items documented the lifestyle of Primus and Betty. It is conjectured that they may have had communal meals in their small house, which really was only 9 by 11, if you can imagine, cellar hole found on that site. The analysis of the bones found on the site may prove that they didn't do farming as we think of farming, but they raised merino sheep. It is known that Samuel Bard was involved with Robert Livingston in treating Livingston's sheep. There are many sagas about the people in Guinea Town. The area changed from being called Short Mountain to being called Guinea because it was a part of Africa and because black people settled on that area at this time. There were about 60 families who lived in that area in Hyde Park at one time. Richard Jenkins, and I have a picture on him, and he's a handsome man. Richard Jenkins was the first sexton of St. James. He was born in 1785. Brayman's notebooks describe him as a Bard Negro, which again suggests that he might have been a Bard slave. It is conjectured after slavery was abolished, Jenkins continued in his job. In fact, there are records that the church paid him. He and his family are buried in the St. James Cemetery. There are many former slaves mentioned in the Edward Brayman's notebooks, with oral tales such as Diana and Harry Anthony, Tobias Catton, Pompey Dunbar Brown, Solomon Garrett, and incidentally, Solomon was a runaway slave from the South who lived in Guinea. Peter, James Purdy, Yonner, and they say Yonner because the Y of her name was pronounced as a yonder instead of jonder. A survey done by Dr. McIndoe in 2007 did not document any graves in the area behind the St. James Cemetery, even though that had been a rumor for years. John McVicker, the first rector of St. James, owned slaves. In fact, Dr. Bard's daughter married John McVicker. Perhaps this was the motivation for giving the land for the building of St. James. The St. James Minute Book shows the name of 7 persons of African descent from 1812 to 1870 who were confirmed in St. James. In all likelihood, these were slaves. Slavery in New York State was abolished in 1827, completing the gradual abolition process started in 1799. This really concludes my talk on Chattel, the building of New York State. I hope you got some information that heightened your awareness. It certainly heightened mine, and it made me want to look for more information, as this subject is such a broad and such a big subject. But it is true, and we are not taught this in our schools. Thank you. Some of you may have other remarks that you would like to give that would enlighten us, or some questions. And we'll be taking a few questions at this point. None? Well, Sue, that's it. Yes, in Lower New York, all of Lower New York, where the Wall Street area, that's incidentally where the African burial grounds are located, yes. Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Yes.
Not a question, this is a statement, but there was a family, the Jenkins family, and they were African American, that go to our church. The older man died a couple of years ago, and 2 daughters. I don't see them much. They do come to St. James. I don't know if it's the same family, but.
Mrs. Carl, and she was the last one to move off of that site where Guinea was located there. Yes, you are correct. That's wonderful. Yeah. They were descendants of the original Richard Jenkins. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Question in the back.
Kind of on the same line, about the descendants like Stoutenberg and this gentleman here. Do you know of any of the descendants that are still living around here?
Yeah, we have. In our audience tonight, she was married to a descendant of James Stoutenberg. You want to stand? Yeah.
And he secured the home that is out on 9G that was Williams Stoutenberg's home. And in the cellar of that home, it is reputed to have been a kitchen and a home for slaves on their way further north.
Thank you.
I worked with one of the descendants of Stoutenberg.
Stoutenberg's, yes. There's a whole line of. Any other questions?
What do you know about the Underground Railroad on this side of the river?
Very little. The Underground Railroad, because of its clandestine features, was not something that was recorded. So anything that you know, it is conjectured. Yes. Anything else?
state to do away with slavery?
No, there were states in the New England with slavery way before New York State did. That's why Annie James went to Portsmouth, New Hampshire.
Because that was, New Hampshire was free?
It was free state. Mhm. Anything else?
Any other questions?
Well, I thank you very much for being so attentive.
Thank you, Lorraine, for coming back to Hyde Park here. You know, you're a repeater.
I know.
You're the first one we've invited back, and what a wonderful lesson in history. I'm glad you went back to school and learned some of those things. What do they call a three-timer? Do they call them a three-peater or so? Would you love to come back again, Lorraine?
Well, we'll
to
see.
Be a three-peater?
We'll see. It's always wonderful being in this facility because of its ambiance, because of its look, because of its history. And so I'm very glad.
Your speech was quite appropriate for this chapel.
Yes, it is.
It was. Thanks very much, and I hope you'll enjoy that and,
Oh, well,
and come
thank
again
you.
with us, Lorraine.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lorraine. We have a couple of announcements. Actually, I want to introduce to you Deb Belding, who is the chairperson and actually a driving force for our Hyde Park Community Garden, which is at St. James. So, Deb?
Lorraine, thank you again. It was a wonderful presentation, very much appreciated. On these cold winter nights, St. James uses these chats as an outreach project and for information for the community. We are very much committed to Hyde Park for over 200 years, as Lorraine can attest, and we celebrated our bicentennial a few years ago very happily. So we do this in the wintertime, and it gives us great pleasure to do this at St. James. And then we start once again in the spring to do a community garden. This is our third year doing the garden. We expanded the garden last year, and we grew thousands of pounds of vegetables that were 100% donated to the Hyde Park Food Pantry, Meals on Wheels here on Hyde Park, and Hillcrest House in Poughkeepsie. As many of you know, the need is still very, very great. We were so thrilled with our our crop last year. However, we have our dear friends who still, they know our garden is there, and they jump over and they ate a lot of our peas and a lot of our beans. They just love them. So we're trying to raise funds to help us with our Build a Fence campaign. And so you'll see that there are some baskets on both sides there, and we would very much appreciate it that if you can make a donation and get the word out about our wonderful garden. And now it's time for refreshments. We thank you very much.
Not yet.
Oh, not yet. Okay, sorry about that.
Actually, I just wanted to thank a few other people. Whenever you do anything like this, there are a lot of people that are pretty much behind the scenes, and so I want to make note of some of them. Of course, we want to thank John and Gloria Golden for restoring the chapel during our bicentennial, and it gives us this opportunity to use it as a space for community events and things like this. So we do appreciate that, and I think most of you probably already know that John celebrated his 90th birthday this week. I also want to thank Bill Millard, who's kind of hidden over here in the corner, for taking care of our audio-visual needs tonight. And in the back is Herb Sweet, who is recording the program for Hyde Park Cable TV. And in the kitchen is Joanne Lone, who is coordinating the reception where we'll be going in a couple of minutes. So there are many other people that are kind of behind the scenes that help to put this together, and to all of you, we do thank you for making it possible. So we thank you for coming tonight. There are 3 other chats scheduled, and if you'll just take note on the back of your program, they're all listed there. And if you can't remember the dates, just remember that it's the first Thursday of the next 3 months. So we do hope that we'll see you at the following chats, and bring some friends. I hope we'll be able to find some room for them. And so we do thank you for coming tonight, and give us a couple minutes and we'll fold up the chairs, and then please join us for some refreshments. Thank you.